Okay, this is going to be a video on my take on shelters. It's pretty much primitive shelters. What we are, we're in survival group number 1, shelter. That's my 10 survival groups. And what I've called it is a pen shelter. It's just a handy acronym that I've made, for want of a better term, a primitive, emergency, natural shelter. Bearing in mind, you can make a shelter out of primitive or natural materials that is not necessarily an emergency shelter. You just may want to make a shelter like that. And you can make plenty of emergency shelters out of materials that are man-made, upturned boats, sheets of iron, whatever you can find out there. So your emergency shelter may not necessarily be primitive natural materials. But as a handy term, for want of a better term, I call it a pen shelter, primitive, emergency, natural shelter. And what I've got here is, I've got a 5-step process. 5 shelters or 5 steps. It's all going to make sense in the end. And here's the 5 shelters here, just very quickly. Your tripod shelter, which I call a tripod emergency shelter in videos in this playlist. Your basic lean-to, a lean-to with a side opening, or what I might call a half A-frame, Lofty Wiseman style. We'll talk about all that in due course. Lofty Wiseman, if you don't know who he is, research him right now, or better still after you finish watching this video. Former SAS, he wrote the SAS Survival Guide. He is one expert I will always refer to. Then the full A-frame with end openings, opening or open-ins. And then number 5 is what I call my full pen shelter, the primitive emergency natural shelter. And bearing in mind, I've got a whole series of 13 videos where I make this shelter in this playlist, including a scale model that I make. 2 of the videos were a scale model. And once you have your basic lean-to, you can then go to either 3 or 4, the lean-to with a side opening or the full A-frame. You can go to the side opening and then to the full A-frame, but you may have to rip out one of your ends that you've enclosed. We'll talk about that in a second. But the full A-frame gives you the best weather protection because it's like a full A-shaped roof. The problem is you may not get the warmth from a fire coming into the shelter. You're going to have a fire out the end of the shelter. The side opening gives you a fire at the side, and it gives you the heat to come in through the shelter. You get the best warmth, but I do question the weatherproofing of the side opening in case you have the wind and the rain coming in at an angle. It may not give you the best weatherproofing, but the full A-frame gives you the best weatherproofing. So that's a choice you may have to make from the basic lean-to to either 3 or 4. But as I said, you can go to 3 and then to 4 in theory. You're making basically my full pen shelter. So in other words, the full A-frame is the same as my pen shelter. The reason I made the pen shelter in those videos was because it's a self-supporting structure with tripods. That's the whole key. Basically, you're going to put a ridgepole into 2 trees, which we'll talk about in a moment, if you're out there making an emergency shelter. But if you don't have trees, or if you just want to build like a hut type of shelter, that's where number 5 comes in, and they're the videos that I make. 2 tripods in place of 2 trees. That's the whole key behind number 5 and those videos, and that's why I made that shelter to start with. The 13 videos in great detail because that's my pen shelter. But ideally you want trees to put the ridgepole in, which we'll get to in a moment. So there's the 5 steps. I also have 4 videos making a tripod shelter, which we'll talk about in a second. I didn't quite get to finish it in terms of the roof, but the roof's pretty much going to be the same as the roof on the full pen shelter. And another note here, we'll talk about that as well, a floor. A floor is as important, if not more important, than a roof in many situations. If you have your shelter underneath a tree canopy, vegetation, you'll get quite good rain protection anyway. And a floor is very, very important to get yourself up off the dirt, up away from water if the water seeps in when it rains. And again, I've got videos online where I really rave about a floor. My favourite floor was a raised timber platform. That may take a bit more work. You have to put material like grass, leaves and so forth, but a raised timber floor is really the best type of floor. So there it is, a quick introduction to my 5-step process to shelters. We're going to break it all down, go through each step, go through the floor, and we'll keep going.